The one and only international affairs analyst Dan Perry, and here in our Tel Aviv studios, the one and only Dan Perry.
Just looking at a broader picture rather than just solely focusing on gun control. Why are we completely avoiding everything else?
I think I can answer the question. I have had to do with the coverage of about 100 countries. None have had the degree of gun ownership that you have in the U.S. Your statement is essentially false. The correlation between gun ownership and the incidence of firearm deaths is spectacularly high. Americans are actually asked to accept something preposterous, which is that there's no connection between how many people have guns and how many people die when you see that there is a correlation. America has about 10 gun deaths per 100,000. That is 40 times more than the rate in Britain, which banned guns. You really think the two aren't connected? There is no country in the world that has more guns than people. That's the case in America. And that's probably why America, with 5% of the world's population, has about a third of the massacres. The connection is obvious. And the NRA's claim that guns don't kill people, people kill people, is preposterous when it's very clear that people with guns kill people.
You know what we're doing. It's not a tactic.
What you are trying to do here is to reduce democracy to its most vulgar baseline of majority rule. And I have to say that that is not so popular, including among Likud voters. The idea that 51% can decide to do anything is infantile. I think if you ask the people, should 51% be able to kill 49%? Most would agree that's not a democratic outcome.
There is a tremendous interest on the part of the West in making clear that authoritarian regimes that are aggressive towards their neighbors cannot and should not prosper. That's obvious. But there's another interest, which is avoiding World War III. And the fact is that Putin's regime is somewhat inscrutable. We don't know what they might do. And there's a delicate balance at play here. That is why the West has been put in a somewhat undignified position of appearing to hedge. And I have a lot of sympathy for people like Biden, because I'm not sure what I would do. It's easy to sit here in the studio and say that Russia must be defeated, but if the consequence of that is nuclear war in Western Europe, then maybe that's not the best idea. It is still conceivable, not likely, I'm not predicting this, but it is conceivable that other things might happen that do not appear to be probable right now. Maybe regime change in Russia. That probably is the best thing. Maybe some kind of compromise involving a slight come down by Ukraine under certain circumstances. Maybe where Ukraine becomes a member of the European Union on a fast track. One can conceive of more creative options than merely going for total victory against a potentially maniacal dictator who could be out of control. I'm saying we have to be wise and not just right.
What is China's game plan?
It's fair to say that China's goal is to achieve global primacy, displacing the U.S. and the West, maybe by the middle of the century. And, you know, by size of economy, it's not inconceivable. They might achieve something close to that. Also, not necessarily true that they will. But, you know, more interesting, I think, more of a challenge where we can be more skeptical is whether they can ever really project innovation as opposed to just industry replication and theft, or whether they can project soft power, the soft power of a true superpower, which requires cultural affinity of the sort that is not their forte, nor something they have necessarily desired. I see no reason why the West should reevaluate its attitude towards Putin. At this point, there's not that much to be done, and the past war, other than the terrible cost wrought upon Ukraine, obviously, has not been unsuccessful from the point of view of the West. Consider how badly Russia has been hobbled. It is no longer able to wield energy blackmail upon the West. It is no longer considered a good faith player in the world economy and in diplomacy. Its military has lost any semblance of deterrence and even of a sense of competence. Russia is going to be impoverished and isolated, as I say, for a long, long time because of Putin. You know, dictators seem invulnerable and omnipotent until suddenly they're not. Like bankruptcies, collapse of dictatorial regimes happens slowly and then quickly. I think that the Democrats, many of them, are currently happy to let the Republicans tear each other to pieces and look like a bunch of clowns, while Biden does his best to speak as little as possible for fear of gaffes or whatnot, and project competence.
There are rich black people in this country. There are poor black people. There are rich Asians. There are poor Asians. There are rich white people. There are poor white people. So to say that the color of your skin is solely determinative of how you can achieve in this culture is not accurate.
Look, I can help you out here because there's a reason why people think that. There is an enormous income gap in the U.S. and an even greater and completely inadmissible wealth gap. And it's understandable if you're talking about immigrants who came from poor and underdeveloped countries. But 10 generations down the road, if this is persistently the case, and if it diminishes not with great speed, then clearly there has been a failure. People's lives are in danger. You simply cannot just turn them away. I mean, there are humanitarian obligations, and there's also just the question of humanity. However, there's a big difference between that and any notion that countries don't have the right to police their borders or to restrict immigration, and that issue becomes ever more acute when there are perceived cultural differences. And I think that is what we're really talking about at the end of the day.
Are the U.S. and Israel getting a divorce?
I don't know about a divorce, but I think infidelity is certainly possible. I mean, Israel needs the
Sometimes it's a
US.
better solution, right?
And Israel has wanted more than a marriage. Israel wants a special relationship, and it has had one. And that relationship is based on more than just interests. The idea of shared values. Now, the current government of Israel does not share values with the Biden administration, Democratic Party, most Americans, and I think most American Jews.
Should French schools ban abiyahs?
Dan Perry, your take?
My take is that a wise man would avoid this debate at all costs.
And yet,
as a liberal, I cannot possibly wholeheartedly embrace bans on clothing or limits of expression. On the other hand, I do respect the right of the French secular state to promote secularism in its state schools if it's egalitarian vis-a-vis all religions and if it has broad public support.
22 years, wow, since the terror attack that changed the world as we know it. Is it a safer or a more dangerous one now? What is the long-enduring legacy of 9/11?
And the legacy is widespread distrust of Islam and even of Muslims, obsession, understandable obsession about security and terrorism, devastating wars that left the Middle East in ashes and weren't that successful. And of course, it took the joy out of flying entirely.
Yeah, you can no longer just hop on a plane with a plastic bag, can you?
If we'll have a deal on the table, a normalization deal, a peace treaty, whatever, I think that Netanyahu will be able to have a majority. The question is, what will happen to his coalition? I have no idea about that. As my colleague said, it will be very, very interesting these coming months.
Yes. Well.
I have to say, Ellie, this is a truly historic day because I find myself in agreement with Mr. Katz. There is no doubt that if Netanyahu succeeds in bringing about this deal, he will have his majority in parliament. Hamas is understood to be part of an Islamist vanguard under the control of Iran to various degrees that is itself at war with moderate Sunni countries that surround Israel. So yeah, I think Israel has some latitude to respond here, but the line of credit is not without limits. The job in the previous rounds was to get Hamas to stop the rocket fire. More or less, that was it. And in each case, that was achieved. Now, the trouble is the degree of savagery that we saw on October 7th, the political earthquake that created in Israel, the strategic disaster that entailed, makes everyone believe that we can no longer go back to the status quo ante and something must be done. But Israel risks blundering into a classic logical fallacy, which is something must be done. A ground invasion is a thing, therefore a ground invasion must be done. Yeah. And I haven't yet heard anyone articulate how a ground invasion would remove Hamas from power without embroiling everyone in not only an almost certain greater loss of life on the ground that would happen October 7th, but risk a massive conflagration in the region, which also, by the way, would be a spectacular gift handed on a platter to Iran. So assuming they're not all idiots, there's savages there, but I'm not sure they're idiots. They must have known something big was coming. And so presumably there are people who foresaw that Israel would go in there, and they're not only just booby-trapping the buildings, but they booby-trapped the entire strategy.
Qatar finances Hamas. Qatar hosts Hamas. And yet, potentially, these are the brokers that may make a difference. Your take?
It's absurd. I watch the world sometimes in utter stupefaction, honestly. When abnormal things become normal, when unacceptable becomes acceptable, the world has some leverage over Qatar. Qatar wants to be accepted as a member in good standing of the community of civilized nations. They host the World Cup. They pretend to be a normative country. I would hope that if the world wanted to do something useful, the West, they would apply maximal pressure on Qatar with a carrot as well as a stick.
Where does this go from here?
I think Israel needs to seize the moment at this point and to understand that the dynamic they've had to date, the kind of war they've waged to date, perhaps cannot continue. And it's time that Israel offer an actual solution on the table for the day after. It could involve free passage for the Hamas leadership to Qatar with 30,000 armed men, let them turn them into construction workers in Doha, bring back a rejuvenated, improved version of the Palestinian Authority, Mohammed Dahlan, whatever, to Gaza, and offer something for the day after. Because if all Israel has to offer is more destruction in Gaza and repeating its goals, which may be impossible to attain given the current paradigm, it's going to be difficult.
Right, Dan Perry, Glenn, thank you so much.
We're normalizing the abnormal here. The Houthis are basically, a lot of people don't know, a militia that has existed for about 20 years in Yemen. They're not the government of Yemen. They're a bunch of thugs, and they need to be put in their place. And I think a lot of, some viewers at least, who've seen me here before, would know me as not a warmonger. But this is craziness. The Houthis cannot be allowed to impede the 12 to 14% of maritime global trade that goes through the Bab el-Mandeb up the Red Sea and through the Suez Canal. This is a recipe for a spike in oil prices, for global inflation, for supply chain difficulties of every conceivable kind. And by the way, hitting them as they well deserve would be a pretty good way to send a message to Iran without directly attacking Iran. And I would hesitate to directly attack Iran. It's a country of about 100 million people that, thanks to Donald Trump, is at this point a nuclear threshold state. So better, perhaps, to make the point by making clear to the Houthis that this cannot stand. And honestly, that the Houthis now claim that they are attacking only Israeli ships and ships headed towards Israel is a very obvious Iranian attempt to create a wedge between Israel and its allies. And I should hope that the allies don't fall for this, main ally being the U.S. Don't allow that to happen, and bring down the boom on the Houthis.
It's not just the Houthis, it's also Hezbollah. Let's turn our eye quickly to the north as well. We've continued to see Hezbollah really increasing their attacks on our northern border.
Yeah, and they're banking on the idea that Israel will learn the lesson of history from Napoleon and from the Nazis and not open a second front. But there's a limit. 100,000 people have been removed from their homes in northern Israel because of this jihadi mafia on the north of the border that has taken over Lebanon. Poor Lebanon doesn't have a president, doesn't have head of the army. It's basically a militia with the country. And there will come a point, and I think that point approaches, where Israel can tolerate it no longer. But I think, and indeed I hope, that the first tactic Israel deploys will be diplomatic, because there is already a UN resolution 1701 passed 16 years ago that requires Hezbollah to place itself and its fighters north of the Litani. And that should be enforced. And I would welcome the world not leaving Israel alone as the front line against this global jihadi onslaught from the Houthis, from Hezbollah, from Hamas, terrorists in Cyprus, and step in and try to assist, because the potential for global escalation becoming very bad for a lot of people and for hitting Americans in their 401ks and Europeans in their blowing up bus stops and metro stations is large. This needs to be cut off in the bud.
Today being Wednesday, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan says Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is akin to Adolf Hitler. This really seems to be just the cherry on top of the cake.
Erdogan is ridiculous. I mean, it gets to the point where it just has to be said. I don't know what's motivating him, if he's lost his mind, or if he has some calculation of really becoming a charter member of the emerging global axis of evil. But whatever it is, it's preposterous. We're talking about a president who has eviscerated democracy in his own country, who massively oppresses the Kurds, who has all his political opposition, including judges and journalists and generals, in jail, who has who've done enormous damage to Turkey itself, who occupies a swath of Syria, who just assisted Azerbaijan in committing the biggest ethnic cleansing since World War II upon the Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh. And he has the temerity to compare Netanyahu to Hitler and Israel to the Nazis. I mean, good Lord. Netanyahu is far from perfect, and I've been a frequent and loud critic, but he is Mother Teresa compared to this pathetic wannabe sultan. There was a movie about 40 years ago called The Year of Living Dangerously. I think that very much applies to 2024.
To every single year, though, this past
But rarely as now, because of course we've been discussing potential escalations around the region. You know, the Houthis, if they wanted to, could really mess up access to the Suez Canal, which is a conduit for about 30% of global container traffic. Already, the 4 or 5 major shipping companies are circumnavigating Africa, which raises insurance costs and shipping costs, messes up supply chains and risks creating inflation all around the world, which of course impacts politics in all these countries that have elections coming up. If Putin should feel like the West is distracted by the Middle East, of course he could try again to take Kiev, and around the corner are the Chinese, who, if they think Putin can get away with that, might even be tempted to attack Taiwan. And all of this can only help Donald Trump in the U.S.